Good morning to our participants in the US and good afternoon to our European audience, and welcome to this webinar organized in cooperation with ETIP Ocean and OES Environmental. My name is Lotta Pirttimaa. I'm the project officer at Ocean Energy Europe, responsible for ETIP Ocean. The topic for today is marine spatial planning and how it can support ocean energy. We have three interesting presentations coming up, and there will be plenty of time for questions and discussion as well. But just before we start, I want to give you a bit of a background. ETIP Ocean is the European technology and innovation platform for ocean energy with the aim goal to promote ocean energy. It's a recognized advisory body to the European Commission, and it brings together ocean energy professionals to share best practices. From the ETIP Ocean team, we have here today Erika Cruz and Teresa Simas from Wavec Offshore Renewables, who are leading the environmental work of ETIP Ocean. As mentioned in the beginning, this webinar is organized in cooperation with OES Environmental, previously known as Annex 4, who are also sponsoring the webinar. OES Environmental examines environmental effects of marine renewable energy development, utilizing TETHIS as the platform on which OES environmental activities are coordinated and recorded. So TETHIS is an online resource where the marine renewable energy community can find tools and research on the environmental effects of marine renewable and wind energy from around the world. And OES Environmental is implemented by the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, from where we have Dorian Overhus, Michaela Freeman, Lena Henry, and Amy Woodbury here today. And a big thank you for cooperating with us for this webinar and for waking up early. I believe it's now 7 a.m. on the Pacific coast. So let's move on to today's topic. In this webinar, we will discuss marine spatial planning, MSP, practices in terms of its support to ocean energy development. Many countries are in different phases of MSP development, with some plans already implemented and others in preparation. So today you will hear experts discussing MSP approaches and opportunities to ocean energy in different regions and what those plans can offer to a more effective ocean energy deployment. Without further ado, we will start with the presentations. After each presentation, we will have time for a Q&A, so please write in the question box on your right-hand side of your screen any questions or comments you have, and I will then read them out to the panelists to respond. We will also be launching poll questions after each presentation, and you can answer them during the Q&A, just clicking on your screen. There will be 2 poll questions for you after each presentation. And as a warm-up, I'll launch the first poll so you can see and test how it works. Okay, we will now show the results of the poll. And now I think we will go to our first presentation, who is from Anne-Marie O'Hagan. Anne-Marie is a Senior Research Fellow in Murray Center for Marine and Renewable Energy and has over 15 years of experience in applied marine and coastal research. The floor is yours, Anne-Marie.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just get my presentation up here. As Lotta mentioned, I am based at the Maritime Centre, which is in University College Cork in Ireland, and I'm also the Irish country analyst for OES Environmental. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about some work I've been doing on marine spatial planning and marine renewable energy in the OES participating countries, OES environmental participating countries. So I suppose as I'm the first speaker, I thought it would be good to start with a few introductory slides on marine spatial planning. And what I've done on this slide is just included a couple of definitions of what MSP actually is. And there are multiple definitions depending on whether you look at academic literature, at policy documents, at legislation. But basically, it's all about trying to improve management in the marine area and making it deliver on sustainable development. So really it's about balancing the needs of development with the needs to protect the environment in order to deliver social and economic outcomes. MSP generally leads to a comprehensive spatial management plan for a marine area or for an entire ecosystem. And it's best to think of this as a kind of a vision for the future. It sets out priorities for the area and defines what these priorities mean in time and space. In terms of why do we need it? Well, I think we all know there's increasing demand for marine resources, especially as we come closer to the shore. There's definitely more competition for space as we have new uses coming on stream. Our management at the minute is very much developer-led or sectoral-led, so it's not integrated. And what that means is that it can be fragmented and the environment can suffer as a result of that. MSP is often needed because there's specific policies in place. So for example, in the European Union, we have the Blue Growth Strategy, and that recommended looking at marine spatial planning and implementing it as a better way of doing marine governance. There's also legal requirements for MSP in many countries. The EU has a directive dating from 2014 requiring member states to have marine spatial plans in place by 2021. There's also legislation in South Africa for MSP in different countries around the world. It should ideally be a process that learns and adapts to changing conditions over time. So it should take things like climate change into account. The problem, I suppose, for MSP is that in the marine environment, there's a complete range of responsibilities at different levels of governance, and that makes it more difficult to achieve one ambition. It's not a replacement for sectoral planning or management, and it's not zoning. So those are just some ideas to have in place. In terms of how it differs from land planning, I suppose the obvious one is that it works in multiple dimensions, so not just on the surface of the sea, but also in the water column and on the seabed. There's a temporal aspect to many marine developments, marine activities. They can vary by season, by time of the year, etc. Also, many marine activities are mobile in nature, and that presents a challenge because they're not static, they move around. They might use permanent structures, or they might use the space, but not permanent structures. Another difference between the marine and land-based planning is that there's no single owner. There's nothing equivalent to private land tenure rights at sea. And if we're taking an ecosystem-based approach in our marine spatial plan, there's also the added difficulty of transboundary impacts and considerations on how we make different planning systems in different jurisdictions work together. There's definitely a need for land planning to link with marine planning. That can be a legal requirement, and it can also be a way of incorporating other planning approaches. A lot of countries in Scandinavia, for example, include coastal waters within their land planning system. So that's another challenge for marine spatial planning. In terms of where we are globally with MSP implementation, it's very much an international effort. UNESCO at the moment, who are one of the key bodies that work on MSP, they estimate that there's about 70 countries now with some form of marine spatial planning in place, be that, setting up a new authority or actually countries which are more developed on marine spatial planning and are amending the first phase of their plans. Australia is probably the best known example, dating from the 1970s in the Great Barrier Reef Park, where they had zoning in place. So that is often cited as one of the first examples of MSP. In the EU, the early movers were Belgium, Germany, the UK and Portugal, and there's also been a number of research projects on marine spatial planning over the years. Prior to enactment of legislation in the EU, there were different drivers in different countries. So for example, in Germany, it was offshore wind. In England and Wales, there was a focus on marine conservation. In the EU generally, the blue growth policy was a key driver along with integrated maritime policy. And here in Ireland, I suppose it was looked as a way of kick-starting economic recovery. In terms of geographic coverage, it usually covers the territorial sea out to 12 nautical miles, and beyond that to the limit of the exclusive economic zone to 200 nautical miles. In some countries, it can include coastal waters, in others it doesn't. So it's very much dependent on what system is in place in the particular country in question. So in terms of the work that I've been doing for OES Environmental, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the State of the Science report. And basically what I'm going to talk about today is an update of a chapter which was included in the 2016 report. And the information was based on a questionnaire conducted with OES environmental countries around the world, with the hope that I would update the information and see how marine spatial planning was impacting upon marine renewable energy development and if there have been any changes. So the questionnaire was circulated to the country analysts in June of this year, and they were given a number of weeks for completion. The questionnaire was broadly similar to that circulated in 2016, and the questions were open so that people could provide as much information or as little as they cared to. And I suppose it has been a challenge because we're at different stages, as Lata mentioned in her introduction. Every country is at a different stage of implementation, so it's challenging to get that information in place. In terms of the questions that were included in the survey, the key themes are listed here in this slide, and they cover, I suppose, general themes like how MSP relates to marine renewable energy plans or policies that are in place, the scientific information needed for MSP, cumulative impacts, potential for conflicts, zoning of areas, tools for MSP and how it's implemented, the relationship between marine spatial planning and consenting or licensing processes, the limitations to implementation of MSP and how the public are involved. And obviously with the time limitations today, I can't go through every one of those themes, but what I hope to do is give you a little bit of a flavour of what's going on globally. So this is a horrible slide, but it's the best way to convey, I suppose, where we're at the minute in the OES environmental countries. And I think if you take anything away from this slide, it's the variety that exists worldwide. As I mentioned, the status of implementation is heavily influenced by the governance system that's in place in the country. And what we see is in large countries, it's very hard to have a national marine spatial planning policy or plan. So often marine spatial plans are brought forward at state level. And I suppose if there's anybody listening from Canada, China, Denmark or Norway and have extra information they can provide me, I'd be delighted. So that just gives you an idea of where we are at the moment. And what you can say, I suppose, is that it's very much dependent on where marine renewable energy is in the country as well. And what I've tried to do here is summarize what exists in the particular countries in terms of national renewable energy strategies, national marine renewable energy strategies, and then whether there are targets for wind, offshore wind or ocean energy in particular. So that obviously changes by jurisdiction. We can see in the European Union that most countries have all of these in place, primarily because the European Union legislation has driven this type of an approach. So there are differences, I suppose, if we look at marine spatial plans that exist, and I've just put up some examples there from France, Sweden and Scotland, and I think it's interesting to see how different countries have addressed this. So for example, in France, it's very much a regional approach, and they agree on how this can be taken forward within the region. In Sweden, it's slightly different because the national sectoral agencies look at areas of national interest and then see how they can take that forward in their planning process. And Scotland, as I'm sure you're aware, we're going to hear more about this afternoon, they selected a case study site to trial marine spatial planning and learned from the industry activity in that area before developing their regional and national plans. So it's just an indication of the way this can pan out in different countries. In terms of scientific data and information, what I have seen from the questionnaire results is that right now, MSP is really driving data collection globally. There has to be a strong evidence base to manage our marine resources appropriately, and the evidence base has to come from up-to-date and reliable information. A key ambition of most governments is to make this information publicly accessible. So we're seeing more marine atlases, more geoportals, and I suppose specific repositories designed to enable access to marine data and to, I suppose, collate all the various sources of data that may exist nationally and regionally. And I suppose moving on or thinking on to the next stage of marine spatial planning implementation, there is an intention to incorporate some of the data that we collect during environmental assessment processes. I think one of the things that comes up an awful lot when we talk about marine spatial planning is the potential to deal with conflicts. And what I've seen so far is that there's very few marine spatial plans which have mechanisms to deal with conflicts or their resolution. I suppose one exception to this is the Portuguese legislation, which specifies a criteria-based procedure that can be used if two activities are competing for the same area of marine space. Generally, though, the preference is to avoid conflict, and the way that most countries do that is to engage with sectors and other stakeholders early in plan development. In countries like Spain and Ireland, conflicts tend to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. Other countries don't, I suppose, zone for marine renewable area, but they have priority areas that have to be protected. So for example, Sweden and France, defense is a priority, followed by nature conservation. In Japan, it's conservation, followed by shipping and emergency access. So if you have priorities designated within your marine spatial plan, then obviously that's going to impact on future uses of your marine area. What I thought was interesting as well was in the recently published Welsh Marine Plan, which was only published last week, along with the state of Victoria in Australia. What the approach they've taken is to publish implementation guidance on how to consider conflicts between sectors as part of the marine spatial plan. And that should, again, help to avoid conflict. This is just an example of the Portuguese, or an example from the Portuguese situation plan, and it shows, I suppose, the potential for compatibility and incompatibility, as well as synergistic interactions between sectors. And it's quite, I suppose, simplistic, but you know, the idea is there, and it shows that, you know, some activities can be complementary and can coexist in one area of marine space. So it's not all bad news. I think internationally there's the intention or the idea that marine spatial planning automatically results in zoning, and from the countries that I've looked at in this survey, that's not the case. There's very few countries that have actually zoned specific areas for marine renewable energy, be it offshore wind or for wave or tidal. In France, is a slightly different approach. Areas that are suitable for marine renewable energy development have been identified in the marine spatial planning process for each sea basin. So in their 4 sea basin areas. At that stage, then they engage with local actors and come up with the idea to develop a low-cost zone, and that's subject to the prefecture's final decision on that. In Portugal, there's designated zones in the existing plan, and if anyone wants to develop outside that zone, then a separate application has to be approved by the authorities. In Japan, they recently changed their legislation to allow development of MRE in port and harbour areas, and this again takes a kind of a combined approach where local government propose the areas and national government have to approve it. But I suppose what intrigued me about this was the fact that you have to have the agreement of the fishermen. So you can see in the map there's areas indicated in red and in blue and also in black. So the areas that are indicated in black were the areas where they couldn't get agreement and which didn't go ahead, and the actual functioning demonstration sites are those coloured in red and in blue. One of the questions in the survey focused specifically on limitations to implementation of MSP and the interaction with marine renewable energy. I think the obvious one that we would all think of is data. Because the marine environment is so dynamic, there is this ongoing need for collection of data, and that came up, I think, in almost every survey response that I got. What I think was also interesting was the fact that many respondents felt that there was more information needed on the environmental impacts of marine renewable energy generally, but specifically on their impact on the local economy and on, I suppose, the social and political aspects. Human resources was also identified as an issue in some countries, particularly because marine spatial planning is still regarded as a relatively new, I suppose, type of planning. So there's not a huge amount of familiarity with the correct, if there is a correct way to do it as yet. There was also the idea that the implementation of MSP was fundamental as to how successful it was going to be. MSP is generally regarded as a strategic process, so it's hard to know what practical impacts it will have at a project or a site level. From some of the countries outside the EU, what I thought was interesting was that they said because of the low technology readiness levels and the demonstration status of some technologies, it meant that they weren't a priority either for planning or in politics, and then that had its own impacts. And what everyone also expressed was that there was a greater need for more understanding and acceptance of MRE and MSP in order to progress development. So in terms of, I suppose, general conclusions, obviously it's still too early to say definitively what the impact of marine spatial planning is for marine renewable energy. But I think we can take encouragement out of the fact that there's some good examples at more local levels, and we are progressing worldwide, even if it is at a slow rate. I think initiatives like today, like OES Environmental generally and ETIP Ocean, are very important to increase the awareness of what is required from planning systems in terms of marine renewable energy. And there's probably a duty on us to involve industry in the planning process as well, because we need to ensure that future needs are incorporated into that plan. So learning and transfer of knowledge to me is critical for the successful planning and management of marine renewable energy as we move forward. That's all I have to say. If anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to take them. And thank you, Lotta and ETIP Ocean, for the invite to talk.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Thank you very much. So before just going to the Q&A, we will launch the second poll for you to answer to. So please take a look at that. And then I'm taking a look at the questions. So please, if you have any questions for Anne-Marie, just write them down in the questions box. We have one, but I can answer this one. Will the presentations be available for download? Yes, definitely they will be on etipocean.eu, so our website, and also on the TETHIS website, so tethis.pnnl.gov, so you can find them there. I can start with the questions, Anne-Marie. I was thinking of what you said on the different zones for renewable energy or wind energy, offshore wind energy. And so in many plans that you said there are specific sites for offshore wind, but not maybe for tidal or wave, or perhaps there are sites for all marine renewables, which means that ocean energy might kind of have to compete with offshore wind. So how can we ensure that ocean energy deployments on sites that are allocated for all marine energy are deployed, given that offshore wind is, getting more visibility at the moment?
Thanks, Lotta. I suppose from my perspective, what I would say is it's key to be involved in the process, and I think that's difficult for technologies such as wave and tidal energy because they're maybe not at the commercial scale yet. Their focus is on, getting their device as efficient, as operational as possible before they think about licensing and about planning, but they still need to be aware that there's a planning system in place and get involved with that, because what we see for marine spatial plans currently is usually where marine renewable energy zones are allocated, it's either where there's an existing commercial scale offshore wind farm or where there's a demonstration site for wave or tidal energy, and those are really the only, I suppose, pre-allocated zones.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. We will launch the second poll, and we already got a question of if the survey results will be made available in a report, and indeed ETIP Ocean is working on that, so Erica and Teresa will be writing some article about the results. I have another question for Anne-Marie. The question is marine spatial planning regulation in the European member states flexible to assign space for new uses or uses, and or to assign new zones to existing uses? Is this something that can benefit the ocean energy sector? Anne-Marie, thank you.
Hi. Yeah, there's a huge degree of flexibility within the Marine Spatial Planning Directive. So it's really very much up to member states how they decide to manage their sea space, provided it stays or it complies with the overarching objectives of the directive. So what that means in practice is that it's up to member states to decide whether they want to zone areas for particular uses, in this case, marine renewable energy. And I think, that'll depend on the country, but there is the scope there to do it. They may need some additional legislative measures in their own country. It very much depends what exists at present. So that's the answer to that. I think it is an opportunity. And also, just to come back on the survey results, this will be a chapter, or the survey results will form a chapter of the forthcoming State of the Science report, so it will be available in that as well.
Thank you. I have one more question for you, and then I think we have to go forward. So what are the hindering points to table for consideration of wind and wave together?
I suppose that's an interesting question, because I think that really comes down to the licensing process and whether your consenting process or licensing process within your country allows you to actually carry out two activities in one area of space and around one site platform or whatever. So for example, in Ireland, you have two different government departments administering energy and aquaculture, and they have two separate licensing processes. So that's a challenge for co-location. But that situation doesn't exist everywhere, and obviously legislation can be changed to enable more co-location or better, I suppose, multiple use of space.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. We have to move forward. So we have the second speaker, Andy Lanier, who is the Marine Affairs Coordinator for the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development. Andy provides excuse me, staff support for the Oregon Ocean Policy Advisory Council and ocean planning processes of the state. The floor is yours, Andy.
Lotta, I'm just confirming that you can see my slides and hear me.
Yes. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you. My name is Andy Lanier. As Lotta mentioned, I'm the Marine Affairs Coordinator for Oregon's Coastal Management Program, which is a part of the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development. And that's kind of a funny department name, and you can just think of that as the state's land use planning program. So thank you, Anne, for going through and presenting a picture of what marine spatial planning is, and a very nice summary of the different activities around the world. To shorten my explanation, it's really, from our perspective in Oregon, an opportunity for us to have a bottom-up collaboration amongst all of our stakeholders and coastal entities that depend upon the ocean for economic, environmental, security, and other interests. And we take that very seriously as a planning agency. Citizen involvement in planning is our #1 goal. So as we move forward, we hope to make the best decisions about ocean space through a process that's guided through the principles of marine spatial planning. First, just a little bit about our program. So the Oregon Coastal Management Program is one of a set of coastal zone management programs around the United States that were authorized under the National Coastal Zone Management Act. Being a federally recognized program means that when the state develops policies and plans and has those plans approved by our parent federal agencies, it allows us to collaborate and ensure consistency in decision making based upon the plans that Oregon has and the other authorities of our federal agencies. And to do that, the state has a networked program in that we depend upon our other state agencies and local government partners, and those are cities and counties, which each have authorities over the resources and have a vision and a requirement to do planning. So for every city and county in the state, there's a comprehensive growth management plan. And for those that exist along the shores of the ocean, that also means that there are ocean planning requirements. And our agency helps the state to implement those. The state has a long history of planning in the ocean. As part of our system of statewide land use planning goals, the state established an ocean resources goal. And that goal mandates, first and foremost, kind of the conservation and protection of important marine habitats, as well as those areas that are important to fisheries that exist. The state was given that authority through passage of the Oregon Ocean Resources Management Act, and that creates the state ocean governance structure and designates our agency as the coordinating entity. As a part of that, we have the stewardship role over the Territorial Sea Plan. And the Territorial Sea Plan is in itself stewarded by our stakeholder advisory body, the Ocean Policy Advisory Council. And our state agencies with authority over the ocean sit on that council in concert with other stakeholders. The Territorial Sea Plan was originally adopted in 1994. As mentioned, it does provide a framework. It talks about the different agencies that do have a role in managing the ocean space. And it, as I mentioned, it designates the Ocean Policy Advisory Council as the advisory body that helps to steward that plan as it grows and changes. And it has done so in a number of different ways. When the plan was first established, as an example, it had a section on nearshore rocky intertidal management, recognizing that the state was actually seeing impacts from things like trampling and increased tourism, and it created a framework for management of the intertidal zone. When the issue of submarine cables came up in the late 90s and early 2000s, the state added a part to our Territorial Sea Plan, which requires that new industry to collaborate with our existing fishermen to agree upon cable routes that will cross the Territorial Sea. And in the case of Oregon, it's actually a much narrower boundary. It's 3 nautical miles from shore. And then finally, when the issue of marine renewable energy came up in the late 2000s, the state decided that it needed a plan for how it was going to proceed with the issue of siting of marine renewable energy development. But to take a step back, the Territorial Sea Plan provides this broad, perspective on ocean management goals, which is really conservation focused to begin with. And it says that, the state has a set of marine renewable resources, and they think of those as the biology, the ecology that's out there in the ocean that creates a resource that we as a state benefit from, both from an environmental perspective and an economic perspective. So a healthy ocean means that the communities that bound the ocean benefit from it. And when we think about new uses, we have to factor in the diversity of the marine life and its functions and the overall health while we are considering whatever that new use is. And the challenge with planning for marine renewable energy development, as probably many of you know, is there is a wide diversity of potential types of activities and actions. And each of these types has a whole suite of potential environmental effects. So the challenge for us from a state perspective, not knowing any one of these power conversion types that may be of interest to any specific company, was trying to create a framework for how the state was going to view these proposed applications relative to its goal of protecting that long-term ecological and economic interest. The Territorial Sea Plan, therefore, is kind of our guiding stone here, and that it provides a mechanism. Not only is it the framework, but it provides the process that the state would go through when it considers any new use. If you start in the upper left of this diagram here, you can see that there were a number of kind of early applications that came into the state that made us realize that we were unprepared to answer this question. And so we then took the immediate next step of understanding what is our resource inventory, what are the natural resources and the human uses out there that we as a state needed to understand that the effects on, the potential effects from any new kind of development. And we went through the exercise of analyzing those resources and uses with the potential for different types of energy. And then based upon those analyses, we developed a plan. Now, once the plan is in place, there are guidance within our now approved Marine Spatial Plan for renewable energy that requires monitoring of the devices to ensure that they're in compliance with the plans. but then also that there's a focus on adaptive management. So understanding and promoting the concept of a phased development. If you want to develop 10 devices and put them out there, we want you to test one first to ensure that it's actually going to withstand the environmental, physical pressures of that environment before you go to a larger scale. So that's the general process by which Oregon considers this new use. And so our first challenge was to evaluate the data that we had in hand. And we did so by kind of intersecting all of our data layers with a planning grid. And then using that grid, we summarized areas of biological or ecological importance, areas of importance to fisheries, and then either the existing uses and users or other special management areas that already existed. And when you look at all of those summaries together, it gives a sense of basically opportunities for a new industry where there are less uses and there's less significance and less risk of harm. Now, this was a spatial planning process that took a number of years to complete. And the Ocean Policy Advisory Council, which is kind of the central hub of this diagram, was the stakeholder advisory body that was consulted as we went through this process. So we spent over 100 different meetings and with our advisory body, we had a spatial planning tool that was used to present this information and solicit public input, that we were looking at the right kinds of data and that we were doing the right kinds of analyses. So it was a very data-driven process to get from a beginning point of just looking at raw data and information to what areas of opportunity are going to be there for this new industry. And the Ocean Policy Advisory Council worked in concert with my commission, the Land Conservation and Development Commission, and its other advisory bodies to create the plan and have that finalized. So the end result of all of this work was a chapter in the Territorial Sea Plan, the Part 5 chapter, and that provides the large policy perspective. It provides our statements of preference for phased and adaptive management. It also depends upon the plan map and area designations. So the plan is spatial in nature, and it's a framework of different types of areas that have different standards associated with it for the review of any proposed development. And that was based upon that completed resource inventory that describes the natural and human uses that are present in the areas. Here's a closer view at the map framework. In particular, a lot of attention in our process was really associated with the lightest green areas. These were our renewable energy facility suitability study areas. So these were the areas that the state put forward as the places it would like to see or would prefer to see energy be developed. There are areas that were excluded from potential development for one reason or another. Those are in blue. And then the rest of the colors are kind of a gradation of the application of standards based upon the resulting resource inventory information. And here's another way of looking at that framework. So on the left side of the graphic here, there's areas that marine renewable applications will not be accepted because there's either a special management area or a use that's too sensitive from the state perspective. On the other end of the spectrum, there was already a permitted area for renewable energy, and this was a small non-grid connected test facility. And so again, the state did have an interest. It wanted to see this industry move forward, and so it was already thinking about how it could promote kind of small scale tests. The proprietary and use management area, like it sounds, that there may have already been another existing user present in that portion of ocean space. We didn't say no per se, but we said, you know, through discussions with the existing proprietary leaseholder, if you could prove that you could have an agreement and work collaboratively and have a compatible use, we would consider that. And then the three kind of resource use conservation area, resource use management area, those are kind of the gradations of the amount of discrete uses or natural resources. And the higher standard for development would be associated with the resource use conservation area, with slightly lower in the management area, and then even slightly lower from a standards perspective in the study areas. Now, the state did create two overlays that apply broadly across the entire territorial sea, given the importance of tourism to our state, and I'll cover those next. The first is the marine recreation area overlay. So where there is a significant recreational use, it defines what that is. And then it defines that if there are going to be significant adverse effects to those communities, then it would be something that we would create standards to protect those communities or not allow development if it was impeding on that ability. And then we did hear a lot about the concern of impacts to the visual landscape. So the aesthetic environment of our Oregon coast is very scenic. There's a lot of diversity in form and function. And we developed a management system that includes a planning phase where we went out and evaluated the viewshed quality from 150 different sites along our 360-mile territorial sea. And we created a viewshed quality data model that correlates standards for allowable impact in association with the viewshed arcs from each of those locations. And then the regulatory phase, when there is a proposed application, and again, depending upon the type of development being proposed, you're going to have different kinds of potential visual impacts. And so an applicant will be required to consider those as it's presenting its proposal for development. So our plan is in place on the horizon for us. We do have a marine hydrokinetic energy test center called PACWAVE. This is a site actually that's going to be sited outside of our Territorial Sea Plan, but will be actually required to be consistent with that from the perspective of laying seafloor cables and such. And it again describes and really, I think, embodies the fact that the state does have an interest. It does want to see Oregon be a center for understanding the availability and the applicability of this kind of development around the world. So that's something that we will be considering in the very near future. And then looking further offshore, the state of Oregon has engaged with the federal agency that manages ocean leasing, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and we are considering engaging on a planning process for looking at offshore marine renewable energy areas for offshore wind. So that is coming up, and I just bring those up to say that the experience that Oregon gained through its own planning in territorial sea waters is going to be leveraged and going to be very helpful for us as we move to consider activities out further in the continental shelf of Oregon. So we created a community of practice, and I believe we do have some trust with our stakeholders and with our agencies that we'll be able to move forward in a way that's consistent with the information that's in front of us and is going to consider the multiple uses that are existing out there in that space. And with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you, Andy. Before going into the questions, I will just launch the next poll. And I already have, Andy, a question for you here. You mentioned that a smaller version of the technology needs to be demonstrated prior to commercial scale deployment. So this person wants to know, what is the largest size demonstration model allowable in Oregon?
I don't think there is a specific size threshold, but if there's an opportunity to have a phased approach to development so that the state and the applicant understands that their technology is going to survive the environment and operate as it is planned. And really the PacWave South is Oregon's, I think, effort at promoting the testing of devices that are closer to kind of a full-scale technology development readiness level, as well as understanding how devices may operate within small arrays. So there's no specific size threshold, but when there is an opportunity to phase in development so that there's less of a risk for if things go wrong, then the state will prefer that approach.
Thank you. I have another question. How are the parts of spatial plans articulated?
I guess I'm not sure what that means.
Can I just ask the person who asked this question to elaborate a bit? So I'll take another question while waiting for that. I was myself thinking of how closer cooperation between neighboring regions, so for example, states that have separate marine spatial plans, how could that cooperation improve ocean energy deployment? I was thinking of a situation where two states maybe have sea border and they're not coordinated, the plans are not coordinated, and someone puts in turbines and another one has aquaculture, and those uses are not really well placed together.
So when the state of Oregon has recognized or understood that other new uses are interested in using ocean space, then we will consider broadening our planning horizons to include whatever that other new use is. While our efforts have been specifically focused around a specific driver. So before marine renewable energy development, marine conservation was a driver, and the state of Oregon established a few special area management zones associated with the goal of protection of the resource. When we were considering marine renewable energy, those goals and those needs were factored in to our plan. And if there are other new uses that will be proposed, then we will apply the resource inventory information and the effects analysis that we've conducted for these other uses in those situations. So the plan will build on itself, and it is being driven by the real world drivers of need.
Thank you, Andy. We will launch another poll. One more question. So Andy, does Oregon have a prescribed tariff rate for purchase of wave energy power generation? That's the question.
To my knowledge, there is no prescribed tariff rate. That being said, the state of Oregon benefits from relatively plentiful and relatively cheap hydroelectric power from our hydroelectric systems on the Columbia River. So we do have a pretty low price per unit of power, and that is one of the biggest hurdles for the industry to get over in terms of competing with how much residents in the state already pay for power. So that is a challenge, and to my knowledge, none of the proposed technology types have come close to our existing power purchase rates.
Thank you, Andy. Now let's hear about marine spatial planning in Scotland. We have here Drew Milne, the Senior Policy Officer within the Marine Scotland, so the Scottish Government Planning and Strategy team. And Drew's current work is focused on the delivery of the new sectoral marine plan for offshore wind, but today he will talk about marine spatial planning for ocean energy. The floor is yours, Drew.
Hello, can I just confirm you can see my screen?
Yes, we can, and we can hear you.
And the slides are working, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for the chance to join you today and to give this presentation. As I was just introduced, my name is Drew Milne. I'm a Senior Policy Officer of the Planning and Strategy team in Marine Scotland. We're part of the larger policy division, which covers marine planning, conservation, and the regulatory body for marine licenses and activity below mean high water springs on our coastline. I have a particular focus on offshore renewable energy, and I'm currently developing the sectoral marine plan for wind. And although we'll try to talk about offshore energy here, a few of the examples on the slides do come from the offshore wind work, so please forgive me for that. Like Andy's presentation, I wanted to give you an idea of what we're doing in Scotland in terms of marine spatial planning by looking briefly at our national and regional plans, and then giving you a bit more detail about our sectoral process, which, as Anne mentioned, is a more spatial and zoning approach, but it's embedded within our wider marine spatial planning system in Scotland. So I thought it would just make sense to give you a little bit of background about Marine Scotland and our responsibilities first. So Marine Scotland is the planning authority for Scotland's seas, and we're responsible for planning and regulation of most activities in our waters out to 200 nautical miles, or the exclusive economic zone. So that equates to around 62% of the total UK seas, and in Scottish terms, that's 6 times our landmass area that we have responsibility over for planning. So Marine Scotland is quite a wide-reaching directorate within Scottish Government, with responsibilities for management of numerous activities and connection to a lot of wider policy areas such as climate change, energy, environmental management. In addition to the policy and planning team where I sit, we also have a licensing operations team, and due to the way Marine Scotland was set up several years ago, we're relatively unique amongst other divisions in that we have our own dedicated science division who advise on a huge array of issues across fishing, fish health, oceanography, ornithology, renewables, pollution response, and that sort of thing. So in terms of marine spatial planning, as was mentioned in the other slides, it has taken a different approach in different countries, and it's at various different stages. In Scotland, this has been delivered and managed through legislation and policy delivery. The legislative background for marine planning in Scotland is set out in our Marine Scotland Act from 2010 and the Marine Coastal Access Act 2009, and that provides the basis for planning in territorial waters out to 12 nautical miles and our offshore waters out to 200 nautical miles. And it does mean we have to marry up with 2 different systems, and that has implications for when we do reviews and how we implement plans. Following that, the Marine Policy Statement is the UK framework, sorry, that's 2011, is a UK framework for marine plans and any decisions moving forward. In this statement, the UK administrators share a common vision of having clean, healthy, safe, excuse me, productive and biologically diverse oceans and seas. And the adoption of that UK-wide marine statement provides a consistent high-level policy context for the delivery, for the development of marine plans across the UK. Excuse me just a second. So again, in Scotland, that has then been translated into specific policy and spatial guidance by our National Marine Plan, which was published in 2015. And then in Scotland, we've elected to take this further into 11 regional marine plans, providing more detail at a local level. Nope, wrong way. So our National Marine Plan, which was published in 2015, covers reserved and devolved issues where possible, all the way to the 200 boundary. It contains at the front and center a presumption for sustainable development and use. And beyond the general plan policies at the start of the plan, each chapter defines sustainability for the sectors or activities described within. It was developed using an ecosystem approach, which supports the growth of marine industries while protecting the environment. And it is a binding plan on all public authority decisions which affect the marine environment. So terrestrial planners, local authorities do need to take this into account if the decisions they're looking at will have an effect on the marine environment, and vice versa. We also marry up to those plans where our areas merge. In the regional planning, we're a little bit further behind with that. They're being developed with adherence to the National Marine Plan, and we're looking to deliver 11 regional plans, with the first to be the Clyde plan, which is the southwest dotted area on your map on the right, and then Shetland, the islands at the north. Marine planning partnerships will be established to take forward the planning with delegated powers in these areas, and stakeholders, local authorities can be represented on these groups during all consultations. So embedded within the national plan and sitting somewhere between that and the regional plans are our strategic sectoral marine plan processes. These plans take a very detailed look at a particular sector or activity and deliver a spatial plan that explores zoning options and fulfills the EU, UK and legislative, UK, Scottish legislative and directive requirements to complete a sustainability appraisal, which will look at the environmental and socio-economic impacts of any plan or program. In terms of ocean energy, beyond the renewable energy policies within our national plan, this is where marine spatial planning in Scotland can directly address the needs of ocean energy development. Just before I go any further, if you're familiar with the UK system for planning and consents, it is a little bit different in Scotland. Whilst we're the planning authority for Scotland Seas, we're not the managers of the seabed, so that responsibility falls to Crown Estate Scotland in Scottish waters. So in an ocean energy example, if you needed exclusive rights to a particular area, you would expect Marine Scotland to do the planning on that, but you secure the lease from Crown Estate Scotland and then come back to Marine Scotland for a license or energy generation consent. And that's a bit different from the rest of the UK, where Crown Estate undertakes both the planning and leasing functions. So the sectoral process looks at a particular technology or a particular type of technology and the specific parameters and requirements that must be considered for that sector. And that also includes the potential impacts of that activity. By adopting the spatial planning approach, the plan will identify the most suitable and sustainable options while assessing those impacts and expressing them as clearly as we can. Excuse me a second, sorry. In order to do this, we must first think about what the plan is delivering, where things are possible, and then an examination of baselines, mapping out constraint and opportunity in both the environmental and our artificial activity of the area. As I mentioned earlier, the plan must take into account all of the policies of the national plan. But because it's a strategic plan level, we'll have to deal with a lot of uncertainty in the planning process. So for those reasons, we will work with a lot of assumptions and often worst case scenarios to allow us to take forward the assessment process. So for ocean energy in Scotland, we've been a lot of the way through this process before. In 2013, we developed and consulted upon draft sectoral marine plans for wind, wave and tidal energy in Scottish waters. These draft options were identified and assessed following a fairly involved process, and I'll show you that slide next. So this image is from our National Marine Plan, and it describes the offshore wind, wave and tidal draft plan options that came forward from that process, along with existing or planned development. So just to clarify, while we're talking about zones, that's not really the language we use. It's options in our terminology. These are not exclusive zones, but their preference should be taken into account by marine planners and decision makers if other development or use of these areas is being considered. So in the most recent work for offshore wind, what that means is that the Crown Estate Scotland will only accept applications for leases within areas that we've defined in our plan, because we've done the assessments and we've characterized those areas. But aiming a project for one of those areas does not guarantee consent, but it does mean that we've done the first stage of the assessment and outlined the issues for a known area. In this case, these plans were not formally adopted, the 2013 ones, due to the changing energy markets and subsidy systems, but they were included in the plan in the National Marine Plan for reference. So the sectoral marine planning process, and I apologize for that diagram, it's fairly lengthy and detailed process designed to address as many of the possible concerns and issues as transparently and as openly as possible. We engage directly with key stakeholders and consultees throughout the process, and there's 2 rounds of open public statutory consultation during this process. So we start out this process by identifying areas of search through an opportunity and constraint analysis, and then prepare the screening and scoping reports for the upcoming assessments. So once those areas of search are identified and that initial analysis is complete, we then refine them through scoping, consultation, and engagement with stakeholders. That takes us to the initial plan framework on that slide, which is the box below the first dotted line. Whilst that's going on, we also develop something called regional locational guidance. This sets out the baseline information for the upcoming assessments and also highlights the key constraints and issues for each draft plan option and the wider region. And it's therefore a primary reference for any developer looking to work in a given area. And we'll include information on environmental, social, and economic spatial data at various resolutions and scales. Whilst that remains a snapshot in time, we also maintain an online spatial resource known as Marine Scotland Maps, which holds a large amount of spatial data and is entirely open to public stakeholders and developers. And we do try to keep that as up to date as possible. From the initial plan framework, we then undertake a sustainability appraisal, which includes the habitats regulations, strategic environmental assessment, and socioeconomic work. And that's to present the impacts, both positive and negative, for the plan options that we've identified through the spatial work. Everything that's then produced is given to our ministers before they make a selection for which options move forward with the process. And then that moves on to consultation and finally an adopted plan or a repeated process if we need to make any substantial changes. So just to briefly cover some of the detailed spatial work that we undertake as part of this process. This is some slides from our images from our opportunity constraint analysis work. And although they come from the offshore wind stuff, the process for ocean energy would be largely the same with parameters changed or constraints swapped in or out. And given that many of the ocean energy devices may have quite specific environmental requirements, it's likely that we could focus this analysis down to preferred areas quite quickly. The analysis here is iterative and is repeated as needed throughout the scoping process. I'll not go into the spatial GIS detail here, except to say that all of these layers are brought together, all these features are brought together, and each one is weighted according to the level of constraint it may represent. And that's where our science team and other policy colleagues really help us out in delivering that that image of constraint, especially in terms of environmental constraint and socioeconomic. this is all presented as part of the initial scoping consultation that goes out to the public, and we take the feedback on board and iterate on the process to refine these areas down. So that's just an example of the socioeconomic model. We produce 3 models as we go through this process: socioeconomic, technical, and environmental. In this image here, there's several layers combined with various weighting, and the higher the darker the color, the higher the level of constraint. And as you can see, as I mentioned in a previous presentation, the areas closer to shore are naturally more constrained. For the environmental data, just to give you an idea of individual features that may be included, we look at things like designated sites, cetacean abundance, bird foraging ranges, sightings, fish spawning, and several more besides. Once that's all brought together, we produce a final constraint map, and that is then clipped with an exclusions layer. So like the matrix diagram that Anne showed with items that are entirely incompatible, we do the same but in a mapping environment and clip those out. In the future, we'd look to run this process again for ocean energy or for wave and tidal plans. And as I mentioned, there are development opportunities in Scotland for the ocean energy, but we need to be able to refine those down to get the most detail and to be able to do that work and deliver a successful plan that meets our energy targets. We would have a better idea now of the site-specific constraints through more up-to-date data and also a better estimate of the potential impact of these technologies as the technology itself has improved or more information has been made available. And that's especially important in terms of interaction with other marine users. We have a large community of marine users and their views and considerations need to be factored into the planning process, and that's why we involve so much statutory consultation and engagement with stakeholders. So when thinking about what we could do to improve the planning process, specifically for ocean energy, it's the data and baseline information that I would look to address first. Planning for these types of projects must take into account the best available information, and it's this area that we can always do more with and add into our planning process. So for example, we've done quite a lot of work in the Pentland Firth and Orkney Waters area, as was mentioned earlier. And that's in that circle there. So in 2007, 2008, we carried out a strategic environmental assessment which assessed the potential effects of 1,300 megawatts worth of development in the west and north coast of Scotland. And this fed into the marine policy statement that I mentioned way back at the start. More detailed work was then undertaken to examine the area, producing very detailed resource maps. And additionally, once areas of potential were identified, Marine Scotland Science were able to undertake their own research and carried out surveys such as high resolution bathymetric work and biotope work to help support any future development. And again, that's all made available through our online tools. In 2010 and 2011, that region was opened up for a wave and tidal leasing round, and 11 sites were agreed in that area. Maygen is obviously one of the best known of those projects, and is now the largest planned tidal stream project in the world, and the only commercial multi-turbine array to have commenced construction. And the last I was checking, it was 6 megawatts in operation at that site. So what's next and what can we improve in this process? We know that Scotland has the resource, but we do need to narrow this down to realistic scenarios and realistic development opportunities. And we would do this through a sectoral marine planning process, which speaks back to the National Marine Plan and regional plans and the information that's available there and their policies and the marine spatial planning system. all the way back to that policy statement of good, clean, healthy, and biologically diverse seas. A spatial sectoral plan will obviously benefit from up-to-date environmental and socioeconomic data and a more accurate model of potential impacts available at an individual and cumulative scale are really important, and the cumulative issue, cumulative impact is a pressing issue for us just now. Projects like Maygen can provide valuable evidence about how these projects perform at scale and what opportunities may be available. And that can be fed back into the iterative approach for sectoral planning by adjusting the process to different levels or aspirations. The process doesn't have to be designed for commercial scale. It can be adjusted to accommodate smaller scale projects or even off-grid solutions, which might be more attractive to smaller projects, especially in the competitive market in the UK for contract for difference and capacity limits. So I just wanted to finish briefly, just to mention that we don't leave those gaps hanging. When it comes to the next stages and addressing these sorts of gaps and these knowledge problems, a lot of the planning work that I undertake relies on our ability to answer some of these, or at least reduce the uncertainty so that we can carry out the assessments to deliver a successful plan. And so we manage a lot of those issues and evidence gaps through our Scottish Marine Energy Research Programme, SCOTMER. That programme essentially is to deliver coordinated and collaborative research to facilitate the sustainable development of the offshore renewable sector in Scotland. And really, in simplistic terms, it's identify and prioritise these knowledge gaps, and then carry out or at least manage the research to address those gaps, and then communicate that back to the wider community stakeholders and policymakers like me and the team. So that is a simplistic overview. It's quite an involved process. It's broken down into 7 receptor groups. It's not wholly set on offshore wind, but obviously a lot of work in Scotland has been on offshore wind. And we've done a lot of work to move through and review and create evidence maps, which are now available online. And we're in the process, or at least colleagues are trying to take that research forward. Excuse me, and I apologize for coughing all the way through that. I realize that's been a whistle-stop tour of what we're doing in Marine Scotland in terms of marine spatial planning and sectoral planning in particular. And I do apologize that some of that was from the offshore wind, but I hope that you might see how the work we're doing will help when it becomes time to do this again for ocean energy in the future. I'm obviously happy to answer any questions I can, or if you want to contact us directly, our email addresses are on the screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chu. We will now launch the second poll and take some questions for you. The first question I can ask you is, does Scotland have a prescribed tariff rate for purchase of wave energy power generation? So the same that was asked from Andy. So does Scotland have any financial incentives to develop the wave energy technology in Scotland?
No, it's a competitive process.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions regarding your slides.
Yep.
So once we close the poll, if you can just go back to your slide on the sectoral marine plans. The question is, if 2 different sectors apply, how will one be prioritized above the other? For example, what kind of metrics can make them comparable?
This one here. Sorry, I'm presuming it's this one there when we have overlapping slides. Yeah, that's a question of priority and which comes first in the consenting process or licensing process. So the policy here is that these areas are the preferred option for a type of activity, so wind or wave or tidal. But the ultimate decision about what is consented and moves forward will rest with the Scottish ministries. Sorry?
Sorry, go on.
No. So it will be not exactly a first come, first serve, but a process of seeing what comes along and what offers the best opportunities for Scotland. So in the new process, we have overlapping areas as well, but it's not an exclusive problem to have them overlapping.
Thank you. Another one regarding your slides. Just a second. Yes, there it is. So the map of the socioeconomic model. The person wants to know, what does this show? Are the darker areas the locations where the maritime space is already in use to provide socioeconomic benefits? Could you just elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was trying not to go into too much detail about those. So what's mapped in here is a spatial representation of socio or economic activity. There's some debate about whether bits and pieces fit in this model or in the environmental. So this is fishing activity, tourism, shipping, navigation, shipping and navigation. The quite distinct lines on the right hand side, or the east of Scotland, are helicopter routes. So these are activities that already take place and are weighted according to whether we think they are either they need to be protected or they will offer major constraint or more constraint to the development, in this case of offshore wind. So helicopter routes are could be a constraining factor due to flight paths and the busy oil and gas area off to the east coast. So when identifying areas for the draft plan, we need to take into account those considerations. So this is just combined into one tool. So you can see quite a distinct, an oblong polygon from Orkney down to the Moray Firth. Oh, hang on, I can move my mouse. Yeah, this one here. That is a military danger area, identifying either live or ammunition or flying aircraft. So we bring all that together, and then that gets combined with technical requirements that looks a bit like this one, and then an environmental equivalent.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was just going to say the full report that outlines this process is available on the link on that last slide there.
Thank you. We have time for a couple more questions, so I'll just pick one here. How does Scotland plan to provide revenue support for future tidal energy projects when the CFD regime managed at the UK level currently has ocean energy competing with offshore wind?
Yeah, that's a difficult one.
I bet.
So some of this is out with the remit of the planning tool. We're working just now on an offshore wind policy statement, and that is looking at that sort of competitive nature of the CFD rounds and what we can do in Scotland to benefit, or to help benefit Scotland. I'd imagine we would have to take some sort of a similar approach to ocean energy, but I'm afraid I'm not familiar enough to be able to comment fully on that right now.
Thank you very much. Then I have a question. Do you find any negotiation mechanism for any conflict that may have occurred for different uses?
Yeah. So as Anne mentioned in her presentation, we're certainly in the camp of early engagement and resolution as early in the process as possible. So in the work I'm doing with the offshore wind plan, we have cross-sectoral steering groups which bring in stakeholders from as many of the interested or key stakeholder groups as we can. So ornithological, fishing, shipping, navigation, safety, as well as industry. We bring them together as early in the process as possible to thrash out these conflicts and to see what can be done. There will always be areas that are identified that somebody else is in or making use of, and it's not so much a prioritization but an understanding of the impacts once we get through to the assessment stage. So that the opportunity constraint analysis that we go through is about minimizing that the potential impact whilst also delivering a sustainable option. And we take note of every conflict and every risk and make that information available, and that's part of the information that goes to the minister, and also part of the information that will be consulted upon to see if people think we're doing it properly. The dealing with conflict is obviously a difficult issue, but we do encourage everybody to come to the table and talk to us as early as possible.
Thank you. We have time for one short question before closing the webinar. Does MSP take account of how minimal some sector space requirement actually require, or are requirements regarded as the same priority?
I'm not sure I understand. You mean
the way I see
small footprint?
Thinking of, for example, smaller devices, for example, wave energy devices that could be quite small compared to big offshore wind turbines. So are they still regarded? Yeah.
Yeah, so they wouldn't be regarded the same. That it would be an appropriate or an apportioning assessment that we would carry out. So one of the assumptions we work on for offshore wind is a capacity per kilometre squared, and we would do an equivalent for ocean energy, and then work back from that to identify a reasonable area. So I mentioned that the SEA for the 2007-2008 work looked at 1,300 megawatts, and off the top of my head I don't know what area that covers, but it would have been assessed or worked out to be a specific footprint, and the same would be applied to other sectors or other users of the sea. So navigation, shipping navigation, whilst the boats may be quite small in comparison, we need larger turning circles and that sort of stuff, so that needs to be incorporated. Excuse me. Sorry.
Thank you very much. That leads us to the end of the webinar. I want to first of all thank all the speakers for your interesting presentations, and all the participants for a fruitful discussion, and also many thanks to OES Environmental for cooperation. The webinar recording and the slides will be indeed published on our website at etipocean.eu and also at ethis.pnnl.gov, as you can see on the slides. Thanks again and have a nice day.